tonight our topic is the conquest of Alexander the Great, fulfilment of Daniel's prophecy. Now we're going to have what I believe is a pretty exciting topic. However, having said that, I know a lot of us struggle with the concept of history, not particularly excited about it, so we will, in the spirit of Alexander the Great, keep this short, sharp and shiny and swift. So stay with me and we'll go on our ride with Alexander. Okay, so first to start off, we want to have a look at this idea of prophecy. What is prophecy? So the Bible is unique apart from all other sacred books in that it stakes its authenticity and its authority on this idea of prophecy, and it claims to foretell the future. Now, I'm not aware of any other book that opens itself up in such a way as the Bible does in this area of prophecy. So one of the good starting points is this quote that we've got up on the screen, Isaiah 46, where God says through Isaiah, "I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from the ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it." So that's a pretty bold statement there, where through Isaiah the prophet, God is saying, look, you can have proof that I exist, and my proof is I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future. And God's essentially saying, not only do I know what's going to happen, but I'm in control of what's happening, and my purpose is going to come to pass. So God claims to foretell events before they occur. Another great quote taken from the same book that we read from tonight, book of Daniel, chapter 4, where we're told, "The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men." So what we're being told there is God's in control of the affairs of this life, and things don't necessarily go the way that we think. You might have the lowliest of men ascended up to leadership positions, and it's because that's God's will, and that's why it's happening. Now, if we were to sort of summarise what is prophecy, we've got a couple of well-known sort of descriptions of prophecy. We've got there, prophecy is the mould of history. So you've got there this idea that there's this mould, and history is poured into this mould, and it can't go in any other way apart from the mould or the shape of prophecy. Another great description of prophecy is history written in advance. So it's basically, we can read it, and then we can watch it unfold before us. Now, this idea of being able to foretell the future, we've got to be careful, because there's a lot of wishy-washy sort of predictions around us, and we want to make quite a strong point, and that's not what we're talking about tonight. So what we've got up on the screen is 5 requirements for a genuine prophecy. So first of all, it has to be made prior to its fulfilment. You can't have a prophecy after the event and someone saying, "Oh yeah, I knew that would happen." That's not very convincing. Second of all, prophecy, it must be beyond all human foresight. So if someone makes some sort of prediction of what's going to happen in the future, that it's pretty obvious, that's not very convincing either. That's not genuine prophecy. Prophecy has to be something outside of human foresight. Now, genuine prophecy also provides details. So you can't have these vague predictions. Genuine prophecy has got these intricate details. We're going to have a look at some of them tonight in Daniel, which we know for certain proves that this is a genuine prophecy. Fourth point there, the prophet, or another interested party of the prophet, they mustn't be able to influence it and cause the prophecy to come true. Otherwise, it's not a genuine prophecy. And fifth, final point, it's got to be obvious that what we're seeing unfold before us was exactly the event that was prophesied originally. So keep those sort of points in the back of your mind. We're going to come back to them briefly at the end of tonight and show how the prophecy that we've got here in Daniel, we can tick every single one of those boxes. Okay, now, you and I are probably well aware of the fact that as humans, we like to sort of look forward, and we love to be able to sort of predict something about the future. It's something that we do on a daily basis. In fact, often you might start the day and you'll check the daily weather forecast. Unfortunately, you'll realise that even in this relatively simple area, the weather forecast isn't actually often that accurate. Maybe a day or two out, it's not too bad, but after then the accuracy drops off pretty quickly. But even still, this idea of being able to forecast the future, we can see how it can be really beneficial, and it would be wonderful to be able to sort of make plans knowing for certain the situation that we're going to be facing. So that's one area of sort of us attempting to foretell the future, and as we said, we're not necessarily very good at it in that area either. Basically what springs to mind there is that fantastic quote that we know well from Jeremiah, where it says, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not of himself, it's not of man to direct his steps." Essentially, we need to turn to God, who's got that wisdom and can guide us in the way. So that's just an interesting background of where we're coming from by this idea of prophecy. Keep in mind, we're not talking about vague things, we're talking about rock solid facts that we can look up, look at the details, and we can see that it's coming to pass before us. So let's have a look at Daniel. Who was Daniel? Well, so reading from the book of Daniel, Daniel was a Jew he grew up in Jerusalem. Now when he was a teenager, the Babylonians came down against Jerusalem, attacked the city. They actually succeeded in taking control, and they went through and they took out the cream of the crop, the princes and basically the smartest of the people, took them back to Babylon, and they put them through a series of tests, work out who was the smartest, who was the wisest. And Daniel was one of these Jewish captives who actually succeeded. He was given the best treatment in Babylon, taught by the wisest experts, and he basically ended up in a position of great authority. Now, we've got written for us in the book of Daniel some of his experiences, but what is of particular interest to us tonight is that Daniel saw a series of visions. One of those is outlined for us here in Daniel chapter 8. So by the time we get to Daniel chapter 8, Daniel's an old man, he's about 70 years old, and this is, I think it's about the third vision that he sees. So, we've read through the vision of Daniel. What we want to do now is, bearing in mind that idea that prophecy is the mould into which history is poured, let's go have a look through this mould, and then we're going to have a look at history and see whether it reflects the mould. So, starting off Daniel chapter 8, we're just going to pick out a few details. We're not getting too in depth here. But essentially this vision starts in verse 3, where Daniel lifts up his eyes and he sees this ram with two horns. The two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. So we've got this symbol here. Interesting, take that in the back of your mind. Verse 4, we saw the ram pushing westward, so possibly it's coming from the east. It goes westward, then northward, then southward, and no beast was able to stand before him. This ram just bulldozed through them all. And we're told there he did according to his will, and he became great. So as Daniel's watching this happen, verse 5, he sees this he-goat come out of the west, and he touched not the ground. He's moving so fast, he charges towards this ram, and Daniel notices that this goat has this notable horn between his eyes. Verse 6, he sees this ram with two horns, basically gets charged into by this goat, and this goat was very angry. Verse 7, we see the ram didn't fare too well. The two horns broke, there was no power in the ram to stand, he was cast down on the ground, and there was no one who was able to do anything to help him. So this goat sort of come from nowhere, swiftly come onto the scene, knocked over this ram, and has usurped its position. Verse 8, we're told that this he-goat waxed very great, and yet suddenly, when it was strong, the great horn was broken, and from this single horn, four notable horns come up toward the four winds of heaven. So that there is a very brief summary of what we're going to tackle tonight. What we've got up on the screen is essentially an illustration of that. Very well done. Now, some of the things we want to pick out of here is we saw that this goat came from the west. We saw that it had a conspicuous horn, so there was a single horn on this goat. He ran at him with powerful wrath. Now, often in the case of Bible prophecy we'll actually get an interpretation in that same chapter. So if you come through with me down to verse 20 and 21, we're going to see here Daniel's actually interpreting for us who these characters of this vision are. So verse 20, the ram which thou sawest having two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So without getting into too much detail, it's very useful being told that this ram with the two horns, that's the kings Media and Persia. So we've got there, we saw that this ram had 2 horns. One horn was bigger and it came up after, and we're told that this is Media and Persia. Now, if we go to the history books, that's exactly what we find out about Media and Persia. They sort of had this alliance, and yet we know that the Medes were the stronger ones, and the Persians came up last and sort of usurped authority. Verse 21, we're told that the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, once again, we're not going to get into too much details, but if you go through the history books, you won't be surprised to discover that in the times where Persia was the empire of the world, over in Greece, you didn't have a united Greek people. They were all different states, and they all had their own rulers, and they'd all sort of have these civil wars amongst themselves. And yet out of that, sort of the first person who could unite them all was this man called Alexander the Great. And lo and behold, we know that Alexander the Great, after setting up his authority in Greece, he came down, attacked the Persians, and wiped them out in an amazing rate of time. And within a very short space of time, he'd essentially wiped out all the Persian army and taken that territory for himself. Now, what I'm going to show up on the screen, we might need to do a sound adjustment here. 2 short videos, they only go for a couple of minutes each. They're basically going to show a very quick summary over Alexander the Great's life, so it's like a 2-minute biography. And then we're going to look at a second video which shows a month-by-month chart of Alexander the Great taking over the Persian Empire. It's fascinating to watch, and it's, it should be pretty exciting.
Alexander the Great was the king of Macedon and was undefeated in battle and acknowledged as a military genius. Alexander of Macedon was born in Pella, the capital of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedon, to King Philip II and his 4th wife Olympias. Alexander was raised in the traditional Macedonian way, learning to read, ride horses, to fight and to hunt. At the age of 13, King Philip appointed Aristotle as Alexander's tutor, teaching him medicine, philosophy, logic and morals. At the age of 16, Alexander was made regent while his father went to war, and in 336 BC, King Philip was assassinated by his head bodyguard, and Alexander was made king by the noblemen and the army of Macedon. Alexander began his reign by eliminating all rivals to his throne, and his mother Olympias ensured that no question remained over Alexander's claim to the throne by having King Philip's youngest wife Eurydice and her daughter burned alive. After Philip died, much of Macedon revolted, so Alexander quickly responded using diplomatic methods wherever possible, and reasserted Macedonian control over the provinces. Alexander then set out to conquer the Persian Empire, and against huge odds he led his armies to victories in Asia Minor, Syracuse and Egypt without losing a single battle. He took Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq at the Battle of Gaugamela and captured Babylon in 331 BC. He was now the leader of the Greeks, overlord of Asia Minor, pharaoh of Egypt and king of Persia. He was just 25 years old. Trade flourished under his rule, and he united the empire with Greek language and culture, and he personally adopted foreign customs in order to rule his vast empire effectively. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC, aged 32. At the time of his death, his empire spanned 3 continents from Greece in the west, east to the Indian Punjab, north to the Danube and south to Egypt, and covered 2 million square miles.
Basically what that was in aid of was to sort of back up what we saw here about this sudden arrival of this Greek goat on the scene, taking out the Persian ram, essentially knocking out all rivals, and then suddenly that notable horn that we saw on the goat what have we got there? Verse 8, the great horn was broken. So we saw there Alexander the Great, massive amount of territory gained, and then at the young age of 32, 33, suddenly died unexpectedly. Now what are we told here? Verse 8, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now once again, if we break out the history books, that's exactly what we see. So Alexander the Great didn't have time to plan for his legacy, so there was no one really to fill the void, and his generals seized control and they took the various territories. So eventually it settled down that there was 4 generals and they each took sort of one of the 4 parts of the empire. So we've got there essentially an amazingly detailed prophecy, and it's exactly what happened when we turn to the history books. Now what we want to do now is go back through and we set those 5 requirements for a general prophecy at the start. Is that what we've got here when we look at this prophecy of Alexander the Great? Let's start from the bottom. So number 5, there must be clear and evident fulfilment. So you'd be hard pressed to find someone who read that vision of Daniel and then disagreed that it applied to Alexander the Great. It's almost like, you know, routinely ticking off one thing after another. There's a very clear and evident fulfilment. Let's step back, let's look at point number 4. The prophet or an interested party must not be able to influence the fulfilment. So we've got here Daniel, he was in Babylon at the time when he received this vision, so we're told there the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. He's not going to be in a position to allow Alexander the Great to come to power over in Greece and to sweep through and destroy a successive kingdom. So after Babylon, then came the Medes and the Persians, and it was Alexander the Great who took out the Medes and the Persians. So basically, there's no way that Daniel could have influenced the outcome of this prophecy. Verse 3, we're told that a genuine prophecy must provide a level of detail. It's not vague, and it's very certain fulfilment. Now, we didn't go into too much detail, we sort of just stepped through here, but it's very interesting to note. So if we go to verse 4, and we see that we're talking about this Persian ram in verse 4. We saw the ram pushing westward, northward and southward. There's an amazing level of detail there. If you go to the history books, you'll find that that's exactly the sequence that the Persians and the Medes took when they established their empire. And once again, there's time and time again through here, there's this incredible level of detail which show for certain that this is a genuine prophecy. Verse 2, it must be beyond all human foresight. Now, there's no way that Daniel would have known that over in this remote area, the Greeks were all going to come together, someone was going to lead the charge. In those videos we watched, he mentioned that Alexander didn't lose a single battle and he faced incredible odds. Now, we could elaborate on that. Some of the battles, Alexander had about 35,000 men, Persians 200,000. And yet Alexander was able to topple them and to prevail in his quest to take over the world. Now, there's no way, you know, if you look at probability, that makes no sense at all. So there's no way this is could be something that someone could surmise might happen. Then we've got here, point number 1, must have been made prior to fulfilment. So we've ticked every single box here, and yet we come back to number 1, and this is the area where all the critics jump in and say, right, no, there's no way, the book of Daniel is too accurate, it must have been written after the fact. And that's been the fashionable thing. If you go to all the encyclopedias, they'll generally say, yep, book of Daniel, it wasn't actually written between 500 to 600 BC when Daniel supposedly lived. It must have been written about 200 BC after Alexander the Great's already taken control, he's fallen off the scene, and the 4 generals have taken the matter over. And the main reason they put for this is they say, right, if you look back through the book of Daniel, there's historical inaccuracies. So these things were written sort of in the 1800s. The archaeologists said, no, there's details in Daniel that don't add up. They don't make sense. There's flaws in the book. It must have been written later. Now, the beautiful thing about archaeology is people stand up and they say these things and then they keep digging and they prove themselves wrong. So if you go back to these old commentators in the 1800s picking flaws in Daniel, you'll find most of them have actually been taken care of due to recent archaeological discoveries. One example of that, commentators said, right, Daniel, if it was written 500 to 600 BC, if you flick through and you look at the instruments mentioned in Daniel, there's Greek instruments, and there's no way that the Babylonians would have known about these Greek instruments. Therefore, it must have been written at a later date. Suddenly, archaeologists go digging, and they do find, in the time period they'd expect, these Greek instruments have come from Greece over to Babylon shortly after they were discovered. So I've got this quote here by this man, J. Baxter, and he said, "The seven-stringed harp invented by the Greek poet and musician Terpander in 650 BC is now found to be in use in Babylonia less than 25 years after that date." So suddenly this argument that the commentators are saying, no, Daniel cannot have been written back in that time period, it falls on its face. Now you can go on and on, you can look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and you can see how suddenly, these amazing old manuscripts, and they've got 8 copies of the book of Daniel. So clearly the book of Daniel was around at this time, and it totally blows those arguments away. So if we go back to our 5 requirements for genuine prophecy, we can safely tick every single box here and have absolute confidence that the prophecy of Daniel we've got here is a genuine one, and it was written before the fact, and it proves without a doubt the Bible must be the Word of God. Now, that's all very interesting. It's nice, we can say, right, it was here in the Bible, we can see it in the history books. Where do we go from there? Well, we just want to briefly finish up by looking at some of the other points that Daniel makes. So up on the screen here, we've got a well-known image. You'd know it as Nebuchadnezzar's image. And this was the first vision that Daniel saw. Now we don't have time to go into all the details of this vision, but we just want to show that essentially this vision shows the different world empires who would be in control. So at the top you've got Babylon. They were succeeded by the silver, which were the Medes and the Persians. Brass was the Greeks. Steel, iron was the Romans, and so on. Now, Daniel 2 verse 44 is essentially the interpretation of that vision, and it tells the story of God's purpose with the world. Verse 44 of Daniel chapter 2, we're told that in the days of these kings, so that's the final kingdom on that image, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And we've got the point there down in verse 45. It's a warning. It's saying, look, the dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. So we've shown from other areas of Daniel that these prophecies made thousands of years ago came true. There's no reason why we shouldn't doubt the verses 44 and 45 coming true either. And in fact, we believe that we're living in those days, and we're shortly going to see that come to pass. So if we want to take away a lesson from Alexander the Great, I came across this wonderful quote, and it said, "For Alexander, the world was not big enough, but a coffin was." So this amazing life, this amazing ambition that he had, it was all abruptly ended at the age of 33, and that's it. All that's left of Alexander is beautiful mosaics and records in the history books. Let's accept the hope of the Bible. We encourage you, if you've got questions about it, come and let us know. We'd love to spend some time, answer those queries, and we'd invite you to join with us, looking forward to the time when the Son of God is going to return and set up the kingdom on this earth. Thanks for your attention.